With me now, the Heritage Foundation Senior Policy Analyst on Education, Jonathan Butcher. Jonathan, so during today's coronavirus task force briefing, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos spoke. She said it's not a matter of if schools should reopen, but it's about how. And she used Fairfax County, Virginia as an example of what a disaster, as she called it, a virtual education can be for students. So this school district, just to paint a picture, recently offered parents the option to keep their kids at home or to send them to school for just a few days. But the Fairfax County GOP chairman himself, Steve Knott, said that the kids weren't getting a full education. So if this was the case, parents should have the option to redirect their tax dollars. Would that be fair?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this decision about whether or not schools should reopen is very much a local decision. It's one that should be made by local schools and educators, and as they talk with health officials about what's happening in terms of the pandemic in their area. I think as federal officials have talked about, though, they shouldn't try to use the CDC guidelines as reasons not to reopen. They're meant to be guidance that can be broadly applied. And it's fortunately, we have seen some states already begin to have in-person classes. So they've already moved beyond it in some states.
Well, what do you say to members of teachers unions, for example, who say that they want to be in the classroom this fall teaching kids face-to-face, they miss them, but at the same time, they are still worried about their health and the health of students? Can there be a happy medium that's reached?
Well, I think it's important to remember that even though they say that they want to get back to school and for classes to reopen, we all want that as well. As you look through their recommendations, though, they begin immediately to talk about large sums of federal money to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, not to mention collective bargaining agreements. And so while we want to be able to take them seriously, it's very hard to do that when you have to parse through what appear to be recommendations as difficult to implement and perhaps not even effective for students as collective bargaining.
Well, and going back to what you said, that this should be left up to state and local leaders to address. Now, one local leader that's been getting a lot of flack over this is New York City Mayor de Blasio. He announced plans today to partially reopen the nation's largest school district in September there in the city. But ultimately, that decision is up to Governor Andrew Cuomo, who says that he's not necessarily convinced that that's the right move right now. He is expected, though, to issue some reopening guidelines on the 13th, but schools have a little bit more. They have, I believe, until the end of the month to unveil their plans. What do you think that says about the leadership in New York when you have the mayor of one of the biggest cities saying one thing and the governor saying another?
Well, when you run into a disagreement like that, it's important for families to look at what the facts are. What are the facts of cases in their area? What does the evidence say that we have seen so far about the effect of the pandemic on young children especially? And what we know from what evidence we have is that they tend to be the least affected. We don't want to put anyone at risk, but there is a serious issue here of students having missed a half of a semester and the potential of delaying school in the fall, which would mean the loss of the equivalent of a full semester, perhaps even most of a year of learning. At some point, we've got to take that very seriously as well.
Well, and Jonathan, based on the data that health experts have collected and made public, do you think that the benefits of reopening schools in the fall do outweigh the potential risks?
Well, I think from what we have, it's going to depend from state to state. Look, back in April, Montana had already talked about reopening schools for in-person learning. Idaho was allowing it to happen district to district and had a private school open. Wyoming, other states that had lower rates of the virus than places like New York City were already talking about reopening. So again, it's going to depend. It's going to depend on what is happening in that local area.
And do you think a lot of these state and local leaders also have done enough to address questions regarding whether, if they are forced to do a teleeducation, do they have the resources that schools need? Are they equipped to do so, especially for some of these larger cities?
Well, when it comes to money, the amount that we spend on public education in the U.S. has only increased. The blip, I think, that we saw after the Great Recession was temporary, and states have recovered since, especially as you go further back and compare what we're spending now to the year 2000, 1990, and beyond. So the issue of money being there isn't the question. I think it's how it's used that's so important. And I think for those districts that had to rush out with some online resources. They just weren't prepared. It wasn't something that anyone, right, was ready for. So
Right.
I think as we look forward, it's going to be important that parents have options, right? We need a landscape that they can choose from.
Yeah, it's always definitely, like you said, these times have been very unpredictable and hard to gauge, but flexibility and mindfulness and negotiations key to all of this. Thank you so much.